The air in the observatory dome was always cool, a deliberate chill maintained for the delicate instruments. I preferred it that way, the constant shiver a small, familiar companion in the vast, echoing silence. My world was defined by the hum of servers, the low thrum of the cooling systems, and the distant, unyielding blackness beyond the reinforced glass of the cupola. Here, nestled on the highest ridge, I was a solitary sentinel, my gaze fixed on the cosmic tapestry. Below, the ancient boughs of the old-growth forest where locals refused to go clawed at the moonless sky, a dense, silent barrier separating me from anything resembling human clamor. I rarely saw another soul. That was precisely the point. My days, and more often my nights, unfolded with a meticulous rhythm. Coffee, black and bitter, was a constant presence beside the main console. It was a symphony of chaos, and my purpose was to find the elusive melody. Every spike, every dip, every spectral line was scrutinized, cross-referenced, logged. My work was my life, a deliberate escape into the grand, indifferent expanse of space, far from the trivialities of the terrestrial. One particular night, the wind howled outside, a mournful lament that seemed to rise from the depths of the forest below. Rain lashed against the dome, blurring the already indistinct shapes of the trees. Inside, the usual drone of the machinery was punctuated by the occasional crackle of static, a common occurrence during atmospheric disturbances. I was tracking a distant quasar, its light having traveled for billions of years to reach my sensors, when a minor anomaly flickered across my primary display. It was subtle, a single, sharp deviation in the otherwise smooth continuum of background noise. My initial thought was equipment malfunction, a stray cosmic ray, perhaps. I'd seen it countless times. My protocol was ingrained: isolate the blip, run diagnostics, filter it out. I cross-referenced the data stream with the secondary array, then the tertiary. The blip persisted, not identical but correlated. My brow furrowed. That was unusual. I paused, my fingers hovering over the controls. The air, already cool, seemed to drop a degree. I could feel the faint vibration of the floor beneath my worn boots, the constant pulse of the observatory's heart. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. The blip wasn't random. It had a faint, almost imperceptible structure. A pattern. My professional skepticism warred with a prickle of something else, something akin to a hunter's instinct. For the next several hours, I meticulously recalibrated the arrays, adjusted the frequency filters, and ran every diagnostic routine I possessed. I even checked the power grid, half expecting to find a faulty capacitor. Nothing. The equipment was functioning flawlessly. The anomaly, however, remained. My initial unease began to deepen. This wasn't a glitch. This was information. The signal, once isolated and amplified, revealed itself as a sequence of pulses, incredibly precise, incredibly complex. It wasn't natural radio emission from a pulsar, nor the broadband noise of a galaxy cluster. It had a mathematical elegance, a deliberate, non-random arrangement that defied any known astrophysical phenomenon. And its origin point, not from within a galaxy, not from a nebula, but from the vast, empty expanse between galaxies, where only stray particles and the faint echo of the Big Bang were supposed to exist. This signal was ancient, its journey measured in epochs, originating from a region of space that should have been utterly barren. Yet here it was, carrying a structure that spoke of intent. My hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as I initiated a deeper spectral analysis. The console glowed, casting an eerie blue light across my face. The hum of the servers seemed to intensify, a low, guttural growl. This was beyond groundbreaking. This was impossible. Every fiber of my scientific training screamed against it. The universe was governed by known laws, by predictable processes. This was a violation, a deliberate, intricate violation of the cosmic order as I understood it. The rhythmic pulses on the screen seemed to gain a new weight, a new significance. They were speaking, not in a language I understood, but in a cadence that implied a terrifying intelligence. My gaze drifted from the screen past the dome's glass into the inky blackness. The rain had stopped. The clouds had parted. The stars, countless and indifferent, burned with an ancient fire. But now, my perception of them felt irrevocably altered. What could have crafted such an ancient, structured message, and for what purpose? My world was defined by the hum of servers, the low thrum of the cooling systems, and the impossible data unfolding on my screens. Sleep became a distant memory, a luxury I couldn't afford. The signal was a relentless siren, demanding my attention, pulling me deeper into its labyrinthine structure. Days blurred into a continuous, unbroken stretch of focus. My eyelids felt gritty sandpaper against my eyeballs, but the images on the monitors held me captive. It wasn't noise. I had spent my entire career sifting through cosmic static, the random chatter of the universe. This was different. This was designed. The initial burst had been a shock, but the subsequent continuous stream was a revelation, an intricate tapestry woven from frequencies and amplitudes that defied every known principle of astrophysics. I fed segments of it into every analytical program I possessed, watching the algorithms churn, process, and ultimately fail. They spat out error messages, or worse, absurd correlations that made no sense. I tried a different approach. I isolated patterns, searching for repetition, for a discernible rhythm. It was there undeniably, but it shifted, evolved, like a language spoken by something that didn't perceive time or space as I did. The complexity was staggering. It wasn't a simple prime number sequence or a basic pictorial representation. It was multi-layered, a fractal symphony where each note contained another, smaller symphony within itself. My mind, trained for decades in the elegant simplicity of universal constants, buckled under the weight of its alien logic. My jaw was perpetually clenched, a dull throb behind my temples a constant companion. Sometimes, a faint, high-pitched whine seemed to emanate from the monitors, a sound that bypassed my ears and vibrated directly in the bones of my skull. I'd glance around the empty dome, my breath catching, but the only sounds were the familiar whir of the ventilation and the distant murmur of the data storage units. Just fatigue, I told myself, just the strain. I started to see the patterns everywhere, in the condensation trails on the dome's metallic walls, in the flickering emergency light above the fire extinguisher, even in the dust motes dancing in the faint light from the observation slit. My vision blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again, playing tricks on me. Was I finding meaning, or was my mind imposing it, desperate to categorize the incomprehensible? Weeks bled into each other. My clothes felt stiff against my skin. This was a message, and whatever had sent it, whatever intelligence lay behind its impossible structure, was beyond anything humanity had ever conceived. One evening, or perhaps it was morning, the distinction had long ceased to matter. A sudden, irrational urge seized me. My head throbbed, my eyes burned. The screens, usually a source of fascination, now seemed to mock me with their inscrutable glyphs. I needed air, real air, not the filtered, temperature-controlled breath of the observatory. I stumbled out of the facility, blinking against the muted twilight. My old Jeep, a faithful but rusty companion, started with a reluctant cough. Without conscious thought, I steered it away from the paved roads, deeper into the winding, overgrown tracks that led towards the periphery of the property. The path narrowed, eventually becoming impassable for the Jeep. I killed the engine, the sudden quiet deafening. Before me stretched the edge of the old-growth forest where locals refused to go. A dense, tangled wall of ancient trees, their branches gnarled and interwoven, blocking out the sky. A perpetual twilight seemed to cling to its entrance, even on the brightest days. I had always avoided it, respecting the quiet, unspoken understanding that kept others away. But tonight, a strange magnetism pulled me forward. The air grew heavy as I stepped beneath the canopy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trees here were unlike any I had seen, their trunks immense, scarred with time, their bark like wrinkled skin. There was no birdsong, no rustle of small creatures, only an unnerving stillness. My boots crunched on a carpet of moss and fallen branches. I walked deeper, drawn by an invisible thread. The light faded further, swallowed by the dense foliage. I felt a prickling sensation on my neck, a sense of being observed, not by an animal, but by something vast and indifferent. The forest seemed to breathe around me, a slow, imperceptible expansion and contraction of its ancient heart. I stopped, straining my ears, convinced I heard a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a slow, deep thrumming resonating not through the air but through the very ground beneath my feet. Was it my own pulse, echoing in the profound quiet, or something else entirely? A shiver traced its way down my spine, independent of the cool air. What was I doing here? And what was this place trying to tell me? Days bled into nights, the sterile glow of monitors reflecting in my tired eyes. The signal, impossibly ancient, relentlessly patterned, had begun to unravel more than just my sleep schedule. It was unraveling the very fabric of my understanding. My colleagues, the few I shared my preliminary findings with, offered polite confusion, then professional skepticism. They spoke of anomalies, of calibration errors, of cosmic noise, but I knew. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate to be random. They spoke of something beyond our current models, beyond even our wildest theoretical frameworks. The elegant equations that had once been my sanctuary now felt like flimsy paper boats against an ocean of unimaginable scale. My instruments, the pinnacle of human ingenuity, felt suddenly crude, blind. I needed something more, something older than astrophysics, something that acknowledged the universe as less a collection of physical laws and more a stage for unspeakable things. Where did one look for knowledge that predated the very concept of science? My search began in the quiet, dusty corners of the university library, far from the polished chrome and digital screens of my own department. I sought not data, but echoes. My fingers, accustomed to keypads, now traced the brittle edges of yellowed pages, inhaling the scent of aged paper and forgotten ink. It was in one such volume, a collection of local folklore compiled by a reclusive historian decades ago, that I found a name. Rather, a description. The antiquarian of the forgotten lore, dwelling on the edge of the old-growth forest where locals refused to go. The entry was brief, almost dismissive, a footnote to a footnote. It pulsed with a strange significance that resonated with the gnawing unease in my gut. What sort of knowledge would be considered forgotten lore in an age of instant information? The journey was long, taking me far from the manicured lawns of academia and the bustling city. My car ate up the miles of asphalt, then gravel, and finally, a narrow, rutted track that seemed barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The air grew heavy, damp, smelling of decaying leaves and something else, something sharp and mineral. The sky above me, once a familiar canvas for my observations, now felt like a vast, indifferent lid. The track led deeper, twisting and turning until the trees began to press in. This was the old-growth forest where locals refused to go. The forest was ancient, its towering pines and gnarled oaks forming a canopy so dense that only slivers of bruised light pierced through. My breath hitched in my throat. The trees were unlike any I had seen, their trunks thick as small houses, their branches twisted into grotesque skeletal forms that seemed to writhe against the pale sky. Moss hung in thick, damp curtains, obscuring what lay deeper within the woods. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by the sheer, unblinking presence of something immensely old, something that had witnessed epochs before humanity had even dreamed of language. My hands gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight. Why did the locals refuse to go here? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees receded slightly, revealing a small, dilapidated cabin, almost swallowed by the encroaching foliage. It was a single-story structure, its timber walls weathered to a uniform gray, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under a heavy brow of sagging eaves. A thin plume of smoke, barely visible, curled from a stone chimney. I parked my car, its modern lines an absurd contrast to the ancient setting, and stepped out. What forgotten thing brings a man of the stars to my forgotten corner? I stumbled through my explanation, omitting the precise nature of the signal, instead speaking of a pattern, a rhythm from beyond, a question about the fundamental laws and pre-human fears. The antiquarian listened, his pale eyes unblinking, occasionally stroking a long, gnarled finger across his chin. He led me into a cavern of books, stacked floor to ceiling, overflowing onto tables and even the floor. The air was thick with the scent of paper decay, leather, and something metallic like old coins. He moved with an unsettling familiarity through the labyrinth, pulling out dusty tomes, unrolling brittle scrolls, his movements precise and unhurried. He presented me with a diagram, etched onto what looked like cured hide, its edges frayed. The symbols were unlike any I had ever seen, yet they resonated with an immediate, terrifying familiarity. Not galaxies, but the spaces between them. At its center, a swirling vortex, not of matter but of absence, and radiating from it, a series of concentric waves, impossibly regular, impossibly structured. My breath caught, my vision blurred. The diagram on the hide was a conceptual mirror to the data scrolling across my observatory screens. It was not a scientific diagram, but something far older, a myth, a warning. My hands trembled as I traced a finger over the ancient lines. This wasn't a coincidence. The antiquarian watched me, his pale eyes unreadable, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. What did these forgotten symbols truly mean for the signal I had found? The antiquarian's pale eyes still haunted my periphery, even days later. His gnarled finger stroking his chin, his silence more profound than any question. I had tried to explain the signal, not as a message, but as a discordant hum against the very fabric of being, a challenge to the fundamental laws. He hadn't scoffed. He had simply watched me, a quiet understanding in his gaze that felt more unnerving than outright disbelief. It left a residue, a cold film on my thoughts. Back in my apartment, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, the faint drone of distant traffic, usually offered a calming rhythm. But now, they felt like thin disguises. I found myself staring at ordinary objects for too long, a stack of books on my shelf. I was certain, absolutely certain, I had alphabetized them by author. Yet there was the invisible man nestled between cosmos and pale blue dot. A minor transgression easily dismissed as my own absent-mindedness, a side effect of sleepless nights spent poring over the signal's data. Then it happened again. My coffee mug, the one with the chipped rim I always turned away from my mouth, was suddenly whole. Not a new mug, but my mug, the chip simply gone. I ran my thumb along the spot, a phantom ridge of ceramic where the imperfection should have been. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The chip was back, a small, familiar crescent missing from the rim. My hands trembled, a trick of the light. Exhaustion playing havoc with my perception. I needed to clear my head. I sought the solace of my work, immersing myself in the spectral analysis, the faint, impossible patterns. Yet, even there, the distortions began to seep in. The glowing lines on my monitors, usually crisp and precise, would occasionally waver, blurring at the edges, reforming into shapes that weren't quite right. Not data corruption, but a visual aberration, like the pixels themselves were briefly forgetting their assigned coordinates. A corner of my lab, where the wall met the ceiling, seemed to ripple, the angle briefly softening, then snapping back into a sharp, uncompromising 90 degrees. My vision swam. I rubbed my temples, the skin clammy. This wasn't fatigue. This was something else. A subtle invasion. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no escape. The dreams began, vivid and terrifying. They weren't the jumbled narratives of a stressed mind. They felt like direct intrusions, external broadcasts beamed straight into my consciousness. I saw impossible geometries, vast, crystalline structures that seemed to fold in on themselves, reflecting light that wasn't there. There were no figures, no faces, only the overwhelming sense of immense, indifferent scale. A sound, too, resonated through these dreams, a low, resonant thrum that was both a vibration and a concept, a deep, pervasive wrongness that echoed the signal I'd detected. The images lingered, sharp and unwelcome, like invasive memories. What was being shown to me? What was being done to me? One morning, the urge became undeniable. I needed to get away from the lab, away from the apartment, away from the creeping sense that my familiar world was beginning to fray at the edges. I drove for hours, the hum of the road a dull counterpoint to the insistent thrum in my mind. I found myself on the outskirts of town, where the asphalt gave way to gravel, and then to a narrow, overgrown track. It led into the old-growth forest where locals refused to go. The air grew heavy, damp with the smell of rich earth and decaying leaves. The towering trees, ancient and knotted, formed a dense canopy that swallowed the sunlight, casting the forest floor into perpetual twilight. The trees here were unlike any I had seen. Their bark seemed to twist and writhe, forming patterns that suggested faces, or perhaps something less defined, more ancient. My skin prickled. A sense of immense age, not just of the trees, but of something far older, pressed in on me. I stopped in a small clearing, surrounded by colossal trunks that seemed to lean inward, forming a natural cathedral. Then I saw it. A patch of moss on a fallen log glowing with a faint, impossible violet light. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, in time with the thrumming I now felt deep in my bones, a vibration that resonated with the signal. I knelt, reaching out a trembling hand. The moss itself seemed to shift, its individual strands weaving and unweaving, briefly forming a pattern that, for a fleeting instant, echoed the impossible geometries from my dreams. My breath caught in my throat. I snatched my hand back, my mind screaming for an explanation. It wasn't bioluminescence, it was something else, something wrong. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and the air around it shimmered. The very leaves on the surrounding undergrowth seemed to ripple, their vibrant green briefly shifting to an unnatural, sickly yellow, then back again. My vision blurred. I could feel a pressure building behind my eyes, a dull ache that resonated with the thrum. Was this the forest changing, or was I? Was my own perception becoming the conduit for these distortions, or was reality itself beginning to unravel around me, piece by terrifying piece? I had tried to explain the signal, not as a message, but as a discordant hum against the very fabric of being, a challenge to the fundamental L, and then his silence had swallowed my words whole. I couldn't stay in the city, surrounded by the oblivious chatter of colleagues who still saw only data points and potential accolades. The signal had begun to feel like a constant, low-frequency tremor beneath my skin, an internal vibration that only I could perceive. My apartment, once a sanctuary of thought, now felt like a glass cage, every surface reflecting my own frantic, searching face. I found an address, scribbled on a decades-old conference program, leading to a place far from any paved road, a place described by the few remaining locals as the old-growth forest where locals refused to go. The journey was long, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to ruts carved deep into mud. My tires crunched over fallen pine needles and moss-covered stones. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, filtering down in weak, fractured beams that seemed to illuminate only the dust motes dancing in the heavy air. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and impossibly wide, their branches weaving a ceiling so complete it felt like entering a vast, hushed cathedral. I parked the car near a skeletal logging road, overgrown with ferns. A faint path, barely discernible, led deeper into the woods. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Only the rustle of my own boots on the leaf litter, and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I felt watched, not by eyes but by the sheer, encompassing presence of the forest itself, an ancient sentinel observing my intrusion. Eventually, through a parting in the dense foliage, I saw it, a cabin half swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. It looked less like a dwelling and more like an outgrowth of the forest floor, a fungus clinging to the roots of a forgotten world. I knocked on the warped wooden door. I knocked again, harder, a shuffling sound from within, then the creak of rusty hinges. The door opened a sliver, revealing a single, roomy eye and a face obscured by a tangled beard and wild, unkempt hair. The eye blinked slowly, then widened, fixing on me with an unnerving intensity. I ran not from the survey team. The academic's voice rasped, dry as dead leaves. The voice was surprisingly clear, though, for a hermit. They stopped coming years ago. No, I said, my voice feeling strangely thin in the heavy air. My name is Marcus. I've come about. The signal. The eye narrowed, then the door opened wider. The academic was gone, dressed in layers of frayed wool, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something else I couldn't place, something vaguely chemical. The cabin was dim, cluttered with stacks of ancient books, yellowed papers, and strange, hand-drawn diagrams tacked to the walls. The air inside was thick with dust and the cloying scent of mildew. Signal, the academic repeated, stepping back to let me in. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like a creature accustomed to infinite patience. They always come eventually. The academic settled into a worn armchair, their gaze never leaving me. You detected it from beyond the galactic plane, I assume, a periodicity that defies all known physics, a signature that implies intent. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the person who understood. Yes, I managed. It's not just a pattern. You understand then that it's not a message for us. It's a fundamental statement about us. A glitch in the cosmic fabric and the entity. It is the weaver, the architect. It doesn't destroy, it reweaves. It doesn't conquer. My hands, resting on my knees, began to tremble. A lines, a discordant note in a symphony it intends to perfect. The signal I detected. It's not a warning, Marcus. It's the hum of the loom, the sound of reality unspooling, being restitched into something else. Something vast, indifferent, and utterly alien to all that we are. They paused, their gaze burning into mine. I could feel the individual hairs on my arms prickling. It's not a physical invasion I should fear, the academic said, their voice now a low, guttural murmur. It's the dissolution of the very concepts that define I, time, space, causality. They are merely constructs, fragile threads it can unravel with a thought. And when they are gone, when we are gone, what then remains of the universe we thought we knew? My mind reeled. The casual, terrifying ease with which they spoke of such cosmic annihilation, the matter-of-fact certainty in their eyes, was far more disturbing than any frantic rant. This was not madness, not entirely. You speak of agency, Marcus, of choice. We are but reflections in a shattered mirror, and the entity simply gathers the shards to forge a new lens. The signal is merely the first tremor. The cracks are already forming. The hum of the signal, which I had only felt as an abstract presence, now pulsed with a terrifying new meaning beneath my skin. What did the reweaving truly entail? My skin, stretched taut and cold, seemed to vibrate with the signal's insidious hum. It was no longer just a frequency I detected. It was a physical presence, a deep, resonant thrum that felt both internal and external, rattling the very marrow of my bones. I stood frozen in the old growth forest where locals refused to go, the ancient trees around me like skeletal sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching into a sky that bled twilight hues. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, offered no comfort. A profound silence, save for the incessant thrumming, pressed in on me, making my own ragged breath sound impossibly loud. What had I heard? I stumbled backward, away from the invisible source of the unsettling vibration, until my back hit the rough bark of a massive oak. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled for the small, portable receiver I carried, its display a jumble of abstract patterns I had once dismissed as cosmic noise. Now they seemed to dance with malicious intent. My analytical mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt besieged. This was not data. This was something else entirely. But what was it, and why did it feel like it was reaching for me? I didn't look back. I couldn't. But the signal, that insidious vibration, persisted. It had followed me. I threw myself into the work, a frantic attempt to regain control, to re-establish the scientific distance I had always relied upon. My fingers flew across keyboards, calling up the complex algorithms I had developed to parse the raw data. I ran filters, applied transformations, searched for any discernible pattern, any conventional structure that could explain the increasingly bizarre nature of the signal. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the growing ache in my shoulders and the dry sting in my eyes. The screen glowed, a kaleidoscope of abstract forms, shifting graphs and numerical sequences. At first, it was just exceptionally complex, a marvel of natural, emergent order. Then, it became too perfect, too intricate. It was like observing the internal workings of an impossibly vast alien clockwork, each gear interlocking with precise, deliberate motion. I started to see symmetries that transcended mathematics, resonances that defied physics. My equations, once so elegant and powerful, buckled under the weight of this new, impossible logic. It was as if the signal was operating on a different set of fundamental rules, a grammar I had never conceived. How could such a thing exist? I isolated a particularly dense sequence, a cascade of frequencies that seemed to spiral into themselves, then unfurl with breathtaking complexity. I tried to map it to known linguistic structures, to musical scales, to anything human. It was none of those things, yet it possessed the undeniable characteristics of communication. Not words, not notes, but something more primal, more fundamental. It was a song, I realized with a jolt that sent a tremor through my chest. Not a song for ears, but for something deeper, something that resonated with the very structure of consciousness. A language of pure intent. As I immersed myself further, manipulating the visualization, slowing down the temporal flow of the signal, I began to perceive not just patterns, but meaning. It was like a sudden, horrific epiphany. The song wasn't random, wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was structured. It had a syntax, a rhythm, a purpose. And it was old. Impossibly, terrifyingly old. The sheer antiquity of its composition, the echoes of eons embedded in its very fabric, made my mind reel. This wasn't a signal from a distant civilization. It was a voice from the dawn of time itself. Then came the fragments. Not data points, not abstract concepts, but impressions. Images without visuals, thoughts without words. A cosmic entity, vast beyond comprehension, yet intimately present. It was an entity that saw flaws in reality itself, imperfections in the fundamental constants of existence. It spoke of correction, of unraveling. And in this reweaving, everything I knew, everything that was, would simply cease to be, deemed an error in its ancient alien calculus. My vision blurred. The air in the bunker suddenly felt thin, suffocating. My hands shook so violently I had to pull them away from the console. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a conversation, and it was speaking directly to me. The song had found an audience, a mind capable of perceiving its terrible beauty, its horrifying intent. Why me? Why had I been chosen to bear witness to this cosmic pronouncement? The signal intensified, its internal thrumming now a frantic pulse within my skull. It felt like a direct transmission, bypassing my ears, my eyes, speaking directly to the core of my being. It revealed glimpses of its terrifying purpose, not destruction but rectification. And humanity, with its fleeting existence and fragile understanding, was merely an anomaly to be smoothed over, a ripple in the vast cosmic pond. The scale of it, the sheer unimaginable scope of this entity's ambition, made me feel smaller than an atom. It wasn't just unraveling reality, it was unraveling me. My sanity felt like a thread pulled taut, about to snap. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? How could I even begin to comprehend a consciousness that sought to rewrite the universe? The old growth forest where locals refused to go had become an echo chamber for something far older than its gnarled trees. I stood frozen, the forest floor a tapestry of damp leaves and decaying wood beneath my worn boots, and the thrumming intensified, a bass note resonating in my chest cavity, making my teeth ache. A low growl seemed to rise from the very earth, a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like the friction of colossal tectonic plates grinding together, yet it was undeniably in my ears. I spun, scanning the ancient trunks, the tangled undergrowth, but saw nothing. The The sound faded, leaving behind an unsettling silence, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the frantic beat of my own heart. Had the forest itself groaned? Or was it merely the blood rushing in my ears, amplified by the signal's invasive presence? The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet soil, and something metallic and acrid like ozone after a lightning strike, but without the storm. My eyes, already strained from the dim light filtering through the dense canopy, began to play tricks. I blinked, and it was a branch again, unmoving, unremarkable. Yet the image lingered. A faint afterimage burned onto my retina. A prickle of unease snaked up my spine. I took a hesitant step, then another, trying to put distance between myself and the perceived menace, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. The ground felt unstable beneath me, the familiar give of damp earth replaced by a subtle, unsettling wobble, as if the forest floor itself were a vast, shallow raft on an unseen current. The sensation was real, undeniably so, yet the instability I'd felt moments before had vanished. Had I imagined it? My breath hitched, quick and shallow. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, every creak of timber became a potential threat. I found myself darting glances over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. Not by an animal, not by a person, but by something formless, something that peered from the impossible angles between the trees, something that inhaled the acrid ozone scent I could taste. The conviction was absolute, irrational, and terrifying. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, felt porous, susceptible to every phantom sensation. Then the trees themselves began to change. Their bark, once a familiar texture of ridges and furrows, seemed to ripple and flow, like molten wax cooling into grotesque faces. Eyes, unblinking and ancient, appeared in the whorls of wood grain, following my every move. They were not optical illusions. They were there, staring, judging. I could feel their collective gaze, a pressure on my scalp, a tightening around my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them until stars exploded behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the bark was still, the faces gone. But the impression remained, a memory of a truth I couldn't unsee. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. I tried to swallow, but my throat was constricted. Yet the leaves on the surrounding trees were still green, the moss vibrant. The dissonance was jarring, an impossible contradiction that chipped away at my certainty. It wasn't a language I knew, yet it carried an immense weight, a crushing burden of ancient knowledge. It spoke of things that should not be, of dimensions folding into themselves, of fundamental constants unraveling. It felt like my very thoughts were being unspooled, rewritten by an unseen hand. "Stop!" I rasped, my voice hoarse, barely audible above the internal clamor. "Leave me alone." The whisper intensified, weaving itself into the thrumming in my bones, becoming a symphony of cosmic discord. My head throbbed, a relentless percussion against my temples. I swayed, my knees weak, the ground threatening to give way beneath me again. The old growth forest where locals refused to go was no longer a collection of trees and earth. It was a living, breathing entity, and I was trapped within its impossible, shifting form. The light, already dim, began to flicker, not like a faulty bulb, but like the very concept of illumination was struggling to maintain itself. I could no longer trust my eyes, my ears, my very sense of touch. Was the ground truly solid, or was it merely my mind constructing that perception? Were the trees truly trees, or were they something else, something vast and incomprehensible, merely appearing as trees to my limited human senses? The line between objective reality and the entity's subjective, warping influence had blurred into non-existence. I pressed myself against a rough tree trunk, seeking solidity, an anchor in the storm of my dissolving perceptions. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat against the encroaching chaos. How much of what I was experiencing was real, and how much was merely the unraveling of my own mind? The old growth forest where locals refused to go pressed in on me, a wall of ancient, gnarled timber and suffocating undergrowth. My head still throbbed, A dull, insistent ache behind my eyes, but the dizzying sway had subsided, replaced by a tremor that ran deeper than mere fatigue. It was a resonance, a low hum vibrating through the soles of my boots, up my spine, settling in my jaw. The air itself felt thick, not with humidity but with an unseen weight pressing down on my lungs. I clawed at the rough bark of a colossal oak, its trunk wider than my outstretched arms, anchoring myself against the lingering disorientation. The whispers, which had been a cacophony moments ago, now receded, leaving behind only the rhythmic thrumming in my bones. It was a silence that wasn't silent, a void filled with the echo of something vast and indifferent. The forest floor, normally soft with decades of decaying leaves, felt strangely rigid, like compacted stone beneath the thin layer of detritus. My gaze traced the towering canopy, a dense, verdant roof that blocked out all but slivers of the bruised twilight sky. The leaves, usually a vibrant green, now held a peculiar, almost metallic sheen, reflecting the faint, unnatural light in hues of sickly ochre and bruised purple. It wasn't the light of dusk. It was something else entirely, a pervasive glow that seemed to emanate from the very air, filtering through the branches like a malignant fog. My skin prickled. Then, the first tremor. Not an earthquake's jolt, but a subtle, sickening lurch, as if the ground beneath me had briefly lost its purchase. I stumbled, my hand slipping on the wet moss clinging to the oak bark. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deeper, slower thrumming that still echoed through my frame. Was it just my own frayed nerves, an overactive imagination twisting the mundane into the menacing? This forest, already unsettling, was becoming something far worse. I pushed myself away from the tree, my boots sinking slightly into the strangely yielding earth. The ground felt spongy, then suddenly dense, then spongy again, as if the very density of the soil was fluctuating beneath my weight. It was an impossible sensation, defying everything I knew about geology, about physics. The scientific part of my mind, the part that craved order and explanation, screamed in protest, but the primal fear was louder, a guttural warning that something was fundamentally wrong. My eyes scanned the dense undergrowth, the twisted roots that writhed like petrified serpents across the forest floor. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, their ancient branches reaching, clawing at the unnatural twilight. The air grew heavier still, thick and viscous, making each breath a conscious effort. It felt like walking through treacle, a resistance pressing against every limb. A low groan emanated from the very roots of the forest, a sound that wasn't wind, wasn't animal, but something deeper, more resonant, vibrating through the earth itself. It was the sound of colossal weight shifting, of immense forces grinding against one another. I dropped to one knee, my hands instinctively pressing against the strangely yielding soil, trying to feel the source of the vibration to ground myself. But the ground itself was the source, a living, groaning thing. Then I saw it. The air, just beyond a cluster of ancient ferns, shimmered, not like heat haze but with a strange, liquid distortion, as if a section of the atmosphere had been pulled taut, stretched thin, and was now rippling like water. The ferns behind it appeared warped, their fronds elongating, twisting into impossible shapes before snapping back to their original form an instant later. The distortion pulsed, expanding and contracting, a silent, invisible breath exhaling across the forest. My mind struggled to process it. Gravitational lensing. In the atmosphere here. It defied all known laws, the signal, the impossibly ancient structured signal. What if it was a ripple, a wave expanding? What if the entity wasn't merely broadcasting its existence, but actively extending its influence, its very presence across the unfathomable distances, reaching, touching, changing the fundamental fabric of reality as it approached? The shimmering distortion intensified, growing larger, encompassing more of the forest. The trees within its expanding field began to groan louder, their branches twisting, contorting, their leaves blurring into streaks of unnatural color. It was like watching a film reel warp and melt, the images stretching and distorting before my eyes. My stomach churned, a bitter bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a distant anomaly. This was a localized, physical manifestation of something vast and alien, something that defied the very laws of physics I had dedicated my life to understanding. Yet just a few feet away, the air shimmered with an unbearable dry heat. The impossible contradictions assaulted my senses, tearing at my perception of reality. The entity wasn't just communicating, it was arriving, or at least its incomprehensible influence was, unraveling the very threads of our world, starting here in this forgotten patch of ancient growth. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me, my gaze fixed on the expanding field of distortion. The forest groaned, a chorus of suffering from the very fabric of existence. The ground under my feet began to shift again, a deeper, more pronounced subsidence, as if the earth itself was sighing, sinking under an unseen weight. What would happen when this correction reached beyond the forest, when its impossible presence fully enveloped our world? The tremor that had seized me in the old-growth forest where locals refused to go did not abate as I stumbled free of its oppressive canopy. It was a resonance, deep and disquieting, a vibration that felt less like an earthquake and more like a discordant hum within my own bones. The air, thin and cold, still carried the faint, metallic scent of something ancient and disturbed. My vehicle, a smudge of familiar gray against the encroaching twilight, seemed impossibly distant, a fragile beacon of the world I knew. I drove not towards my home, but towards the only place I still felt any semblance of purpose, my laboratory. The university campus was a ghost town at this hour, its brick buildings looming like silent sentinels under the bruised sky. My office, a sterile box of gray steel and fluorescent hum, offered no comfort. My notes, meticulously organized, now seemed like hieroglyphs from a forgotten language. The data streams, once a source of exhilarating discovery, now pulsed with a malignant rhythm I alone seemed to perceive. The signal. It was still there, undeniable, a structured symphony of impossible age and intent. I had to make someone else see it. I had to make them understand. I called a senior colleague, my voice hoarse, the words tumbling out in a desperate torrent. It's not just a signal, it's an instruction. It's changing things fundamentally, the very constants. The background radiation isn't what it was. There was a long pause, punctuated only by the faint crackle of the phone line. Marcus, the colleague's voice, usually crisp and authoritative, was now laced with an unfamiliar softness, a gentleness that felt like a dismissive pat on the head. I sound exhausted. The pressure of this project, I imagine. It's groundbreaking work, of course. Exhausted. No, I'm terrified. It's real. The anomalies, they're escalating. I could hear the rustle of papers on their end, the distant clatter of a keyboard. Life continuing, oblivious. Marcus, I understand your passion, but these claims, rewoven reality, that's a rather dramatic interpretation of a data anomaly, wouldn't you say? Perhaps you need a break, a proper rest. We can look at your data again together in the morning, with fresh eyes. The voice remained calm, reassuring, but it was the calm of someone humoring a child, not engaging with a fellow scientist. My jaw clenched. They weren't listening. They were hearing a tired mind, not a dire warning. No, you don't understand. There won't be a morning if we don't act. This isn't a theory, it's an observation. The constants are shifting. Small, subtle, but undeniable. I've rechecked the instruments, calibrated them a dozen times. I'm sure you have, Marcus. You're always thorough, but sometimes when we push ourselves too hard, our perceptions can become skewed. I'll call you first thing, get some sleep. The line went dead before I could protest further. Sleep. How could I sleep? The tremor was back, not just in my bones, but in the very air around me. I gathered my most damning evidence, the comparative spectrographs, the fluctuating cosmic background readings, the impossible mathematical structures embedded within the signal itself. I printed them, stacked them, a precarious tower of impending doom. My next attempt was with the department head, a pragmatic woman who valued empirical evidence above all else. Her office was a fortress of polished mahogany and framed achievements. I laid out my case, my voice strained, my hands gesturing wildly at the printout spread across her imposing desk. I spoke of the signal's impossible age, its non-local origin, its profound impact on the fundamental forces I had meticulously observed. He listened, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. "Marcus," he finally said, his voice a cool, measured tone, "your work on the signal has been truly remarkable, a significant contribution to the field, but these conclusions, they verge on the speculative. The unraveling of reality is not a phrase we typically use in astrophysical discourse. But it's happening." I slammed my hand on the desk, the stack of papers jumping. The sound echoed in the quiet office, loud and desperate. The gravitational constant, it's oscillating. The fine structure constant. These are not anomalies, they are systemic shifts. The universe itself is being rewritten, and this signal is the blueprint. He picked up one of my graphs, him long fingers tracing a line. "Marcus, I respect your dedication, but such claims without independent verification, without a consensus from your peers, they raise questions about your judgment, and frankly, your well-being. We've noticed your increasingly erratic behavior, your isolation, the long hours." Her eyes, when they finally met mine, held no anger, only a profound, almost clinical pity. Perhaps a temporary leave of absence would be beneficial, to rest, to regain perspective. A leave of absence. They wanted to sideline me, to dismiss the greatest threat humanity had ever faced as a symptom of my own failing mind. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, viscous, pressing in on me. The polished surfaces of her office seemed to warp at the edges of my vision. "Go home. We can discuss my sabbatical options in the morning." I stumbled out of her office, the fluorescent lights of the corridor buzzing like angry insects. It was absolute isolation. I was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. The universe was unraveling, and I was the only one who saw the threads fraying. What could one man do against an oblivion no one else would even acknowledge? I stumbled out of her office, the fluorescent lights of the corridor buzzing like angry insects. The cold pity in her eyes, the polite dismissal, the implication of my own failing sanity, it was worse than any explicit threat. I was alone. For a time, I simply existed. The apartment became a tomb. I ate when hunger became a physical ache, slept when exhaustion dragged me down, but my mind never truly rested. It replayed her words, the chief administrator's dismissive wave, the bewildered expressions of my former colleagues. They saw a man losing his grip, a mind succumbing to strain. They didn't see the truth. They couldn't. Not yet. Then the world began to flicker. At first it was subtle. A news broadcast about inexplicable seismic activity in regions previously stable. Reports of migratory bird patterns shifting violently, flying inland instead of towards the coast. The internet, a sprawling nervous system of human connection, began to hum with strange anecdotes. A farmer in the plains swore his barn had rotated on its foundation overnight. The angles of the roof subtly altered, impossible to correct. A fisherman in the northern seas recounted how the stars, for a single, terrifying minute, had appeared in the wrong constellations, the familiar patterns fractured and rearranged. I dismissed them as mass hysteria, the collective unconscious grasping for meaning in an increasingly chaotic world. I tried to, but the patterns, the sheer wrongness of the reports gnawed at me. They echoed the impossible signal, the non-Euclidean geometry it implied, the disruption of fundamental constants. My hands trembled as I scrolled through forums, past the dismissive comments and the sarcastic memes to the desperate pleas for explanation, the terrified confessions of those who had seen what I had seen or glimpsed its shadow. One post, buried deep, caught my eye. A local, writing in a dialect thick with fear, spoke of the old-growth forest where locals refused to go. He mentioned a specific glade deep within the forest where the very air felt thin, where time seemed to stutter. This wasn't hysteria. This was a beacon. I packed a bag with desperate haste, a few meager supplies, a worn compass, and a digital recorder. My car, faithful and unremarkable, felt like a fragile shell against the encroaching strangeness of the world. The drive was a blur of highway and secondary roads, the landscape outside the window seeming normal yet subtly off-kilter. A row of telephone poles leaned imperceptibly to the left. A field of corn swayed with a rhythm that felt wrong, too uniform, too precise. My skin prickled. A faint, earthy scent, heavy with decay and something else, something metallic and sharp, hung in the air. The silence was immediate, absolute. No bird song, no rustle of leaves, no distant hum of civilization. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots like breaking bones. The air was cool, damp, and tasted of loam and something indescribable, like static electricity mixed with old blood. The trees here were colossal, their trunks gnarled and thick with moss, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense green ceiling. My compass, a reliable instrument I'd owned for years, spun wildly, then settled on an impossible vector, pointing due west, then north, then southwest, all within a single breath. My breath hitched. This was it. The signal, the entity, was manifesting here. I plunged into the undergrowth, pushing through ferns and thorny bushes that snagged at my clothes. Each step felt heavy, as if the ground itself resisted my passage. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by the very fabric of the forest. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The trees began to change. Their bark, once rough and familiar, now showed patterns that seemed to shift, lines that didn't quite connect, angles that defied the natural growth of wood. A cluster of saplings grew in a perfect, impossible spiral, their leaves shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. Then I saw it, the glade. It wasn't a clearing so much as an absence. The trees around it formed a wall, but the space within was empty, unnaturally so. And in the center, a single monolithic stone, perfectly smooth, perfectly black, rose from the earth. It wasn't carved. It simply was. But it was the air above it that truly froze me. The air itself shimmered, not with heat haze, but with something else, like a ripple in a forgotten pond. Time was stuttering, just as the local had said. As I approached the stone, my steps faltered. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the very atoms were rearranging themselves. A low hum vibrated in the air, deep and resonant. Not a sound I heard with my ears, but one I felt in my bones, vibrating through my teeth. The edges of my vision blurred. The trees around the glade, already unnaturally angular, seemed to stretch, their forms lengthening and twisting, becoming something not quite trees, something other. I reached out a trembling hand towards the black stone. My mind reeled, the point of contact, the place where the impossible signal had finally breached the veil. My head swam. The world tilted. What would happen if I touched it? The polite dismissal from the administrator still stung, a phantom slap across my face. They thought me broken, a mind unraveling under the weight of its own isolation. They were wrong. My mind was not unraveling. It was merely shedding the comforting lies of three-dimensional space, stretching beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. The signal, once a whisper, now sang in my bones, a resonant hum that vibrated with a terrible truth. I clutched the worn leather journal, its pages filled with frantic sketches and fragmented equations, the only proof I had. Where else could I go? The city, with its predictable angles and human chatter, felt like a cage built for something I no longer was. The signal had led me to the edge of the known, and now it pulled me further. It directed me with an undeniable, internal compass towards the one place I knew no one would follow, a place even the most hardened locals avoided. My battered sedan, a relic of a more grounded life, bounced along the gravel track. The engine coughed, protesting the journey, but I pressed on, my grip tight on the steering wheel. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight, once a cheerful yellow, fractured into sickly green shards as the canopy above me thickened. The track eventually dissolved into a barely visible game trail, choked with brambles and gnarled roots. I parked the car, its metallic groan echoing in the sudden silence, and stepped out. The old-growth forest where locals refused to go swallowed me whole. Here, the trees were not just tall, they were colossal, ancient sentinels whose branches scraped the bruised sky. Their bark was a roadmap of forgotten ages, scarred and furrowed. The air itself felt different, heavy and still, as if it held its own breath. No birdsong pierced the quiet, only the distant, almost imperceptible sigh of wind through impossibly high leaves. My own breath hitched, a shallow, ragged sound in the vast emptiness. My skin prickled. The signal, once a hum, now pulsed behind my eyes, a rhythmic throb that intensified with every step deeper into the gloom. My hyper-awareness, a cruel gift from the signal, amplified everything. The faint tang of ozone in the air, the subtle shift in the Earth's magnetic field, the microscopic tremor of the forest floor, I felt it all, absorbed it all until my nerves felt raw, exposed. My determination, born of isolation and certainty, warred with a rising tide of primal fear. The trees grew denser, their branches interlocking overhead, forming a perpetual twilight. The light that filtered through was a bruised purple, making the twisted roots on the ground appear like grasping skeletal fingers. I stumbled, catching myself on a slick, moss-covered stone. This place felt like a membrane, a thin veil separating my world from something else. Then the signal broke through the mental barriers I hadn't even known I possessed. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was pressure, a physical weight pressing down on my skull, forcing my vision to swim. The purple twilight intensified, swirling into patterns that defied logic. My knees buckled. I fell to my hands and knees on the damp earth, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. The ground beneath me wasn't stable. It felt as if it were rippling, breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the colors were inside me now impossible hues, violet and ochre and a shimmering, nameless silver. They twisted, folding in on themselves, forming geometries that hurt my brain to perceive. A cube that was also a sphere, a line that was simultaneously infinite and utterly contained. When I opened my eyes, the forest was gone. Or rather, it was still there, but overlaid with something else, something vast and terrible. The air solidified into facets, planes of existence intersecting at angles that defied Euclidean space. I saw it then, not as a creature, but as a presence that warped reality around it. It was a shifting, tessellating form, a mosaic of impossible dimensions. Its surface was not a surface but a continuum, where depth and breadth were meaningless. It was made of pure concept, a living equation that rewrote the rules of space. I was seeing the scaffolding of reality, and this entity was not merely observing it, it was editing it. The impossible shapes I witnessed were not random. They were part of a colossal design, a repatterning. It wasn't trying to destroy, it was trying to correct. To bring existence into alignment with its own alien, fundamental logic. Our reality, our physics, our very concept of dimensions, they were all just flaws to be ironed out, an imperfection to be smoothed over. The understanding crashed over me like an ocean wave, drowning out all other thoughts. We were not part of its plan. We were an anomaly, a statistical error in its grand reordering. Our world, our lives, our hopes, our loves, they were all just temporary glitches, soon to be erased and reformed into something utterly incomprehensible to us. My body convulsed, a violent shiver racking my frame. I was seeing the truth, and the truth was that we were nothing, less than dust. It was not malicious, not evil in any human sense. It was simply absolute. A cosmic artisan reshaping the universe according to a design that made our most fundamental laws seem like childish scrawls. I felt myself being stretched, my mind pulled taut across infinite vectors, my physical form dissolving into the impossible colors. Was this the end of me? Or merely the beginning of something far, far worse? They were wrong. My mind was not unraveling. It was merely shedding the comforting lies of three-dimensional space, stretching beyond the comfortable confines of what we called reality. I knew what was coming. The signal had sharpened. its presence no longer a whisper in the static but a resonant hum in my very bones. I drove until the asphalt surrendered to gravel, then until the gravel gave way to a track barely wider than my vehicle. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a primordial perfume. The trees here were not merely old, they were ancient, gnarled titans whose branches clawed at the sky like arthritic fingers. This was the old-growth forest where locals refused to go, a place whispered about in hushed tones, where the shadows held a different kind of darkness. A perfect stage. I cut the engine, plunging the clearing into a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very sound of my breathing. My own heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, was the only disturbance. The trees loomed, their bark slick with moss, their roots, thick as pythons, snaking across the forest floor. A pervasive, earthy smell like overturned soil and something metallic filled my nostrils. I pushed deeper, the undergrowth snagging at my trousers, the forest canopy swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. The deeper I went, the more the forest pressed in. The air grew still, losing its faint breeze, becoming stagnant and heavy. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin as if countless unseen eyes were tracking my progress. The trees themselves seemed to shift, their forms blurring at the periphery of my vision, becoming less like wood and more like solidified thought. Then it began. Not a sound, not a tremor, but a subtle unraveling of the world around me. The vibrant green of the moss on a nearby boulder seemed to deepen, then shift, becoming a color I had no name for, a hue that pressed against my optical nerves like a blunt force. The texture of the bark on a tree I touched became simultaneously rough and impossibly smooth, a contradiction my fingers could not reconcile. My stomach churned. A wave of nausea swept over me, forcing me to lean against a trunk that felt, for a terrifying moment, as if it were breathing. The light changed. It wasn't fading, it was warping. The air itself shimmered, not with heat haze, but with a distortion that made the distant trees waver like reflections on disturbed water. I tasted something metallic and bitter on my tongue, a flavor that seemed to originate from the air itself. My hands trembled, my vision blurring at the edges. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the world back to its accustomed order. When I opened them, the forest was different. The ancient trees still stood, but their branches now intersected at angles that defied geometry. Leaves, once individual forms, now seemed to coalesce into vast, intricate patterns, like fractals of thought. The ground beneath my feet felt less like solid earth and more like compacted concepts. A profound, silent pressure built in my skull, as if my very thoughts were being re-indexed. This wasn't destruction. It was something far more terrifying. It was reordering. The very fundamental principles governing existence were being rewritten, not with violence but with an indifferent cosmic precision. I saw a bird, a flicker of brown movement, freeze mid-flight, its form dissolving into a cascade of shimmering, non-Euclidean angles before simply ceasing to be. Not gone, but unconceived. My breath hitched, my throat constricted. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped, only a dry, rasping gasp. The forest, once a place of earthly life, was transforming into an alien tapestry. The moss on the rocks became intricate, living algorithms. The air, once breathable, now felt like a medium for unimaginable calculations. I felt a profound, crushing awareness of my own insignificance, a fleeting pattern in a vast, silent correction. The entity was not destroying, it was optimizing. The sky above, previously a familiar canvas of blue, fractured into a mosaic of shifting, impossible colors. Not colors I could name, but sensory inputs that bypassed my visual cortex entirely, etching themselves directly onto my consciousness. The ground vibrated not with an earthquake, but with a deeper, more fundamental resonance, a hum that seemed to realign the very atoms of my being. My knees buckled. I fell, my hands sinking into soil that no longer felt like soil, but like the fibrous strands of a colossal living brain. The stars, if they still existed, were no longer pinpricks of light but points of data in an incomprehensible equation. My memories, my identity, my very sense of being Marcus, felt like fleeting, inconsequential errors in a grand, silent computation. The correction was complete, or perhaps only just beginning. What remained of me in this reordered reality was merely an observer, a flicker of consciousness in a universe that had shed its old skin. Had it always been this way? My mind was not unraveling. It was merely shedding the comforting lies of three-dimensional space, stretching beyond the narrow confines of what they called sane. They, with their polite smiles and their dismissive gestures, understood nothing. They clung to their neatly categorized reality, a fragile construct of predictable physics and observable phenomena. I, however, had seen the cracks. I had heard the whispers from the deep, not just through a radio telescope, but in the sudden, profound silence that followed the signal's first touch. The truth, as I now understood it, required a different kind of observation. It demanded surrender, a willingness to gaze into the true void, not the one between galaxies, but the one within existence itself. My research, my instruments, they had been mere crutches. The real work began when I left them behind. They called it cursed, haunted. I knew better. It was merely unaligned, a thin spot in the fabric of things. The journey was a blur of highway lines and the hum of my old sedan. I packed nothing but a rucksack with some water and a compass, though I suspected the latter would be useless where I was going. The air grew heavier as I approached, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, but also something else, a metallic tang like ozone after a lightning strike, yet far more ancient and pervasive. It was the smell of proximity. I left the car on a forgotten gravel track, overgrown with weeds, and plunged into the undergrowth. The canopy immediately swallowed the sky, plunging the world into a perpetual twilight. The trees here were not merely old, they were antediluvian. Their trunks were gnarled, twisted columns of bark, thicker than any I had ever seen, reaching upward like skeletal fingers grasping at a sky that had long forgotten them. Moss, thick and velvety, clung to everything, muffling my footsteps, absorbing all sound. A profound stillness settled upon me, deeper than mere quiet. It was an absence of sound, a vacuum where the chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves, even the distant cry of a bird, simply did not exist. My own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in this vacuum. My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, felt like a trespass. The ground underfoot was uneven, a treacherous carpet of roots and decaying logs. I stumbled often, catching myself on rough bark that felt strangely alive beneath my fingertips, vibrating with a subtle internal hum. Was it the wind, or something deeper, resonating through the very structure of the wood? I pressed my palm against a particularly massive trunk, feeling the faint tremor, a low thrum that seemed to align with the growing pressure behind my eyes. My breath plumed before me in the dim light, momentarily visible before dissolving into the pervasive gloom. I pushed deeper, my determination fueled by a growing certainty that I was nearing the source, the signal. It hadn't come from between galaxies, it had merely manifested there. Its true origin was far more intimate, far more terrifying. It was the fundamental flaw, the tear in the fabric. I reached a clearing, if it could be called that. It was more of a circular depression, surrounded by the tallest, most ancient trees. Their branches interlaced so tightly that no sliver of sky was visible above. And in its very heart, a stone. Not a natural boulder, but a slab roughly hewn, obsidian black and impossibly smooth to the touch. It hummed. Not a sound I heard with my ears, but a vibration felt in my teeth, in the marrow of my bones. This was it, the focal point, the place where the comforting lies thin to transparency. It pulsed with a faint internal light, a deep violet glow that was almost imperceptible, yet it illuminated the very air around it, revealing shimmering distortions. The trees around the clearing seemed to twist, their massive trunks subtly shifting, blurring at the edges as if their very existence was being rewritten, pixel by pixel. A sound began then, not from the forest, but from within me, or perhaps through me. It was the signal, no longer a faint hum, but a roaring crescendo of impossible frequencies, a choir of cosmic static that shattered every notion of harmony. It was the sound of existence itself being unstitched, thread by thread. My head throbbed, my eyes watered, and a profound nausea gripped me, twisting my gut. I pressed my hands against the obsidian slab, desperate to understand, to merge. The violet glow intensified, wrapping around me, pulling me into its depths. My vision blurred, the forest dissolving into a chaotic kaleidoscope of impossible angles and shifting colors. I felt my own body begin to unravel, my senses merging, taste becoming color, sound becoming texture. The entity was here, not as a presence but as an absence, a correction. It was not destroying reality, merely refining it, stripping away the superfluous dimensions, the comforting illusions of causality and form. I saw it now, not with my eyes, but with a new, terrifying organ of perception. The universe was a flawed equation, and it was the operator simplifying, reducing, until only the most fundamental, terrifying truths remained. My body began to hum, vibrating in sympathy with the stone, with the forest, with the very fabric of the unraveling world. I was no longer Marcus, the astrophysicist. I was a resonant frequency, a data point in a vast, incomprehensible computation. My thoughts became echoes of the signal, fragmented and profound. The last thing I saw, or perhaps felt, was the forest itself collapsing inward, not with a crash but with a silent, graceful folding. The towering trees, the ancient earth, the very air, all compressed into an infinitely dense, infinitely featureless point. And then that too was gone. Was this oblivion, or merely a new beginning stripped bare of all meaning?